Situational theories are great examples of using a constructionist explanation for sport, deviant, and violent behavior. These explanations were developed to provide a greater focus on the individual or the small group context of understanding deviant behavior. Some basic assumptions are as follows. Human behavior is not fixed. This includes deviant behavior, meaning it's not predetermined. It's very malleable and flexible. Actions of deviant behavior do not mean that the person is necessarily quote-unquote bad, but that they conform to different behaviors promoted within their group or subculture. We all engage in deviant and non-deviant behavior. Most of the deviant behavior occurs in some sort of social group context. These are important because deviant behavior is really associated with this idea of being part of groups. Okay? So if this is what we're kind of really trying to look at and understand, then we want to think about the process leading up to deviant behavior. And what these theories are saying is that you're going to be more likely to engage in deviant behaviors if you associate with others that have kind of been involved with or understand deviant behavior in a different way. So for us, what I'm going to try to do is, this is going to be related to us, right? Because we're dealing with sports. So associations with others that have deviant norms. Think of close groups of athletes, the bonding that occurs within these social groupings. Situational inducements that allow deviant behavior to occur, sometimes born out of feelings of injustice, right? So for us, these individuals, maybe they feel misunderstood by everyone. As a result, it becomes an us versus them mentality. And so they say, you know what, forget it. Who cares what people say? We're just going to do whatever we want to do, and sometimes that's associated with deviant behavior. Differential association is one way of looking at and understanding these types of theories. It was developed by Edwin Sutherland in the late 1940s, and it's probably the best known interpersonal theory of understanding deviant behavior. Again, it is, much like labeling theory and some of the other theories that we'll talk about from this constructionist point of view, it's very simple. And that's why it's so useful, and that's one of the reasons I like talking about these theories. The basic assumptions are, all behavior is learned, and this includes deviant behavior. The learning of deviant behavior is going to occur in these small, informal groups that are very, very impactful on us, such as peers. And this learning results from the collective experiences of that particular group and from the situational or the occurring events of going on around the people at that moment. The environment is influencing the individual. So how does differential association relate to this understanding of sport deviance? Here's a couple of different things. Different acts of deviant behavior are learned in small group settings, right? And if we know that, then these peer associations increase the opportunity for learning and engage in deviant behavior. For many people, one of the overriding positive things about participating in sport is developing these close-knit peer associations, these groups. Another thing is that sport is comprised of individuals who share relatively unique experiences. The uniqueness of these experiences really increases the social or group cohesion. It brings people closer together. So then the opportunity to quote-unquote learn deviant behavior increases exponentially because of this close group cohesion. Maybe even things like peer pressure. You want to do something to be a part of and maintain your membership in that group. Here's a pretty famous example from Major League Baseball and how steroid use and differential association kind of work together. In 1992, you had the Texas Rangers, who were pictured here, and these are some of the more popular players at the time. And this particular person over here, Jose Canseco, admitted in his very famous book to literally teaching his teammates how to use and understand steroids. All these individuals, including Alex Rodriguez, who is not pictured in this particular photo, have been accused, discovered, or admitted to steroid use. These were elite athletes. One person was showing them and teaching them how to engage in this deviant behavior, whether it's through peer pressure, whether it's through the close bonding of the group. It's hard to say because a lot of these folks won't necessarily just come out and admit the entire life course of those conversations, but nonetheless, this is how the learning of deviant behavior might occur. Okay, so differential association talks about learning deviant behavior. It's very popular and still used today. However, another theory called drift theory, and it's somewhat similar, but it's also equally useful when looking at and understanding some aspects of how we interact or relate to sport deviant behavior. Drift theory has two basic distinctions and differences from differential association. The first, drift theory assumes that deviant behavior is to be largely based upon the individual choices, and these individual choices are associated with the situations around them. So it's much more of a focus on choices. Okay? Individuals tend to be frustrated or angered over the quote-unquote injustices or things that are not fair that they see in rules and reactions around them. And as a result, they tend to become very alienated. And this psychological alienation is really important because individuals are pulling away from the larger idea of right and wrong, and they're staying in their small groups. Okay? Some basic concepts of drift theory, and the reason it's called drift theory. Drift. Most people obey society's norms and values and rules, but sometimes people drift into and out of deviant behavior depending upon either the situation or how they're feeling, their mood. That right there is the basic core of the entire theory. Now, the techniques of neutralization were followed up a few years later by Sykes and Matza because, okay, if you drift into and out of deviant behavior, why are you drifting into and out of it to begin with? How do you rationalize that process? And that's what the techniques of neutralization are. And there are 5 major techniques to neutralizing the moral reprehension associated with engaging in deviant behavior. 1 is you deny responsibility. You're going to blame it on something else. Number 2, you're going to deny the injury. Nobody was really hurt, so what's the actual harm in doing something? Number 3 is you're going to deny the victim. This person had it coming, kind of a thing. They hurt me, therefore they should be hurt. Number 4 is interesting. Condemnation of the condemners. It's the people that are usually authority figures that are sanctioning you as an individual. You say, well, you're not perfect. You engage in deviant behavior as well. And we'll talk about this one in detail on the next slide. And then finally, appeal to higher loyalties. The immediate demands of that small group that you're a part of that's so very important actually take precedence over larger cultural or society rules. Okay, how can all of these techniques of neutralization, how can they be understood, or what are some sport examples? These are the sport examples. Denial of responsibility. If you go back to the famous horrific incident involving Michael Vick and the FBI probe into looking at interstate gambling, well, a lot of the focus was on the dogfighting, and that's what a lot of the social focus on. And a former NFL player, Clinton Portis, was talking about how the culture of the rural Deep South actually promotes dogfighting, especially the types of cultures that these individuals were from. And he said they're just dogs. And so it was not surprising to him that Michael Vick was actually involved in promoting and organizing dogfighting rings, and then people were betting on them. And what Mr. Portis was saying is that he was from a kind of a group or a culture where dogs were not seen as pets, they were seen as beasts of burden. They were there to do specific things. Engaging and making money for their owners was one of them. So there's a bit of denial of responsibility there. An example of denial of injury, the recent Hall of Fame wide receiver Terrell Owens was talking about the NFL celebration rules. Prior to the 2017-2018 season, when the NFL opened up celebration rules for players, they were pretty strict, and they didn't like players celebrating and take a lot of focus from the game and putting the focus on themselves. And Terrell Owens was kind of famous for his NFL celebrations, and the thing that's interesting is he didn't get into a lot of trouble, quote unquote, off the field. But Terrell Owens was sort of labeled, if we're talking about labeling theory, labeled as a bad teammate. And a lot of people talked about this focus that he would put on himself during the game. And so when talking about these very strict celebration rules at the time, he would say, it's not like I killed anyone, I'm just being me. That's a great example of denying the injury. I'm not really doing anything that's harmful, I'm just celebrating after I scored a touchdown. Okay, denial of the victim on many levels in baseball, but let's really focus on professional baseball. So the hitting a batter the next time that batter is up because they showed you up the last time. So if you have a pitcher who throws a pitch and the batter actually hits a home run but maybe celebrates way too much, going from home to first, first to second, second to third, and on the way home. If you want to think of sort of Joey Batista and famous bat flips and things like that, well, the next time that batter comes up, either that pitcher or another pitcher is going to hit that batter because they were disrespectful. And so it's a great example of denying the victim. Condemning the condemners it's kind of an interesting one. And when you had the Major League Baseball probe and the Senate subcommittees that were looking into steroid use, PED use, performance-enhancing substance use, all those different types of things, a lot of the players were saying, yes, you're catching me doing this, but one thing you need to think about, one, everyone is doing it, and the commissioner and other people in baseball knew about it, and they didn't care because revenue streams were at all-time high. Right? What's really good for baseball and baseball attendance? Well, hitting home runs. And so, yes, you catch me as a player who is engaging in steroid use, which is technically cheating, and in some instances illegal. And yes, you're going to come down hard on me, but you, as the commissioner, you as Major League Baseball knew that not just me as an individual, but other players were doing this, and you didn't care about it. But now that it's a big social issue, now you're trying to find problems in the individual players that did it. That right there, that whole process, that narrative, is a great example of condemning the condemners. And then finally, appeal to higher loyalties. If you kind of think back many years ago, the Malice at the Palace, when you had the Pistons and the Pacers in the NBA that got into a fight, and that fight actually then spilled into the crowd, and Ron Artest was, he was ejected for fighting in the actual game, and so he was laying down over on the scores table, and someone from the crowd threw a beer in it, and it hit him. And so he jumped into the stands to try and fight the fan that was throwing things at him. Okay, and we know that to be very deviant, yes. Steven Jackson, who is now works in the media side for NBA and professional basketball, actually jumped into the stands to follow his teammate and help him out. And then when fans were spilling onto the court and things like that, Jermaine O'Neal, another former NBA player now, he actually punched a fan on the court. And a lot of them were talked about, well, I needed to have the back of my teammate. Because as we know that Ron Artest, when he jumped into the stands, that was deviant. But the other players feared for Ron Artest's safety while there. So this is that whole appeals to higher loyalty. What's more important, the loyalty to your group or the loyalty to what the NBA wants, to what U.S. laws wants, those types of things?